When I came to the wedding, my daughter said, "Mom, I'm sorry, but you weren't invited. Leave." I quietly left. 2 hours later, all $300,000 in wedding payments were canceled by me. At that same hour, Good day, dear listeners. It's Clara again. I'm glad you're here with me. Please like this video and listen to my story till the end, and let me know which city you're listening from. That way I can see how far my story has traveled. I paid for everything. That's the part people forget, or maybe they never knew. They see a grandmother, 64 years old. Silver hair, she stopped dyeing 3 years ago because her late husband Harold said it looked like moonlight. And they think, sweet old lady, probably just happy to be included. They don't see the woman who built a catering company from a single food truck in 1987, who put 2 children through college without a cent of debt, who wrote checks without flinching because she believed, genuinely, deeply believed, that money spent on family was never wasted, ever. My name is Margaret Ellen Caldwell. People call me Peggy, and this is the story of the worst and best day of my life and how both happened within the same 24 hours. My daughter is Claire. She's 31, beautiful in that sharp-edged way that photographs well, but sometimes cuts in person. I was proud of her. I am still proud of certain versions of her. The girl who stayed up reading, the teenager who cried at the end of To Kill a Mockingbird, the young woman who called me every Sunday morning from her college dorm. Somewhere along the way, that girl had been replaced by someone I didn't fully recognize. I told myself it was stress. I told myself it was the wedding planning. I told myself a lot of things. The man she was marrying was Derek Holt, 35, real estate developer, the kind of man who fills a room with his voice but not necessarily with substance. I tried to like him. I sat across from him at dinner tables and asked him questions and listened to his answers and smiled. But there was something in the way he looked at my daughter, not with adoration, but with ownership, that made the back of my neck go cold. The warning signs had been there for nearly a year. It started small. Claire stopped asking my opinion on things, then stopped mentioning things at all. When I called, our conversations shrank from an hour to 20 minutes to a brisk 10. She forgot my birthday in March. Not a card, not a text, nothing. When I mentioned it gently, she said she'd been overwhelmed with the venue deposits. I let it go. Then came the Easter Sunday when I drove 40 minutes to her apartment and found no one home, despite the confirmed plans. She texted 2 hours later. "Something came up, sorry, Mom." Derek's name was not mentioned, but I noticed she'd posted a brunch photo with him on Instagram that same afternoon. The engagement had been announced in November. By December, Claire had begun forwarding me invoices. The venue, $78,000. A converted vineyard in Napa Valley that Derek had insisted upon. The catering, $52,000, not my company, a firm Derek's family used. The flowers, $18,000. The photography, $14,000. The band, the dress, the rehearsal dinner, the honeymoon hotel block, the favors, the lighting installation that Claire described as just little fairy lights, Mom, but which turned out to involve a specialized crew from Los Angeles. It all added up. I tracked every payment in a spreadsheet. By the time the last invoice cleared, I had spent $312,000. I didn't do it for Derek. I want to be honest about that. I did it because I loved Claire, and because Harold would have done the same, and because somewhere in the back of my mind, I believed that this kind of generosity was also a kind of bond, a thread between a mother and a daughter that couldn't be cut. I was wrong about that last part. The wedding was on a Saturday in June. I wore a pale blue dress, the one Claire had approved in a photo 3 months earlier. I had my hair done in the morning. I drove to the vineyard alone because my son Thomas, Claire's younger brother, had not been invited. a fact that had already caused its own quiet devastation, which I had swallowed. I arrived at 2 in the afternoon, 90 minutes before the ceremony. The vineyard was stunning, I'll give it that. The fairy lights were strung between old oak trees, and the late afternoon sun was already finding angles through the leaves that made everything look like a painting. Guests were arriving in clusters, women in pastels, men in linen. I didn't recognize most of them. I smiled at people who didn't smile back because they didn't know who I was. I found Claire near the bridal suite, a converted barn at the far end of the property. She was in her dress. She was radiant. For one moment, just one, I felt the pure, clean joy of a mother watching her daughter become something. Then she saw me, and her face changed. It wasn't surprise. It was something colder. She glanced to her left, where Derek's mother, Vivienne Holt, was standing with a glass of champagne and an expression I can only describe as anticipatory, as if she'd been waiting. "Mom." Claire's voice was low, controlled. "What are you doing here?" I blinked. "I'm here for your wedding, sweetheart." "You weren't invited." The words landed like something physical. I actually took a half step back. Around us, 2 of Claire's bridesmaids had gone very still. Vivienne took a small sip of her champagne. "Claire," I said carefully, "I paid for this wedding." "That was your choice," she said. "But this is my day, and I need you to leave." I looked at my daughter, really looked at her, and I saw something I hadn't let myself see before. She meant it. There was no regret in her eyes. There was resolve. And behind that resolve, faint but unmistakable, was the shape of someone else's influence. I did not cry. I did not raise my voice. I said, very quietly, "All right." And I walked back to my car. It was 2:17 in the afternoon. The ceremony was scheduled for 3:30. I had time. I sat in my car for 11 minutes. I know because I watched the clock on the dashboard, the way you focus on small concrete things when the larger ones are too large to hold. The vineyard's gravel lot was filling steadily around me. Valets in black shirts moved between cars with practiced efficiency. Through my windshield, I could see the oak trees, the fairy lights not yet lit in the afternoon sun, the white chairs arranged in their perfect rows, all of it mine in every sense that mattered and apparently in none of the senses that counted. $312,000. I'm a businesswoman. I've been a businesswoman since before Claire was born. I did not build a catering company by being sentimental about numbers. So I made myself do the thing that hurts most and clarifies fastest. I did the accounting. The venue had been booked under a contract I had signed and paid in full 6 weeks ago. Final payment, $78,000. Wire transfer, non-refundable per the standard cancellation clause. But I had read the contract, and there was a force majeure addendum, and there was also a specific clause about material misrepresentation by either party. I had a contract attorney. Her name was Diane Patel. I had her number in my phone. The catering firm, Hartwell and Associates, had received a 50% deposit of $26,000, with the balance of $26,000 due upon service completion, which had not yet occurred. The photography studio had received a $4,000 deposit, balance of $10,000 on delivery of final edited images, not yet delivered. The florist, the band, the lighting company. Most had been paid deposits, not full amounts. I opened my phone's calculator and began making notes in my voice memo app. Something I've done for 30 years when I need to think out loud. My voice was steady. I was surprised by that, the total I could potentially recover if I moved quickly and correctly, somewhere between $180,000 and $220,000. not all of it. The venue deposit was almost certainly gone. Some of the smaller vendors were paid in full, but a significant portion was still recoverable if I acted before services were rendered, if I acted now. And here is where the fear came in, because the fear always comes. That is not weakness. That is biology. My hands were cold on the steering wheel. I thought about Claire in her dress, the way she'd looked for 1 second before her face changed. I thought about Harold, who had been gone for 6 years, who would have known what to do, because Harold always knew what to do. And I felt the specific grief of having no one to call who loved me the way he had. But then I thought about Vivian Holt and her champagne glass and her anticipatory expression, and something in me went very quiet and very clear. This had been planned. That was what the quiet clarity told me. Claire's exclusion of me had not been an impulse, a bridezilla moment, a stress response. It had been organized. Vivienne had been standing there, ready, calm, almost satisfied. She had known I was coming. She had known what Claire was going to say. She had expected me to walk away, quietly, hurt, too proud to cause a scene. And then the wedding would proceed, paid for by me, celebrated without me. And that would simply be the new order of things. I was 64 years old and I had been managed. Was I going to accept that? I already knew the answer. I had known it, I think, in the 11 seconds after Claire spoke and before I replied. The all right I had said hadn't been surrender. It had been the sound of a door closing so that another one could open. I called Diane Patel at 2:24 p.m. She answered on the third ring, slightly puzzled. It was a Saturday. I spoke for 4 minutes, giving her the facts in the order they mattered. The contracts, the payment amounts, the dates, the situation. Diane was quiet while I spoke, then asked 2 sharp questions. I answered both. "I'll need the contract documents," she said. "I'm emailing them right now." I had them in a folder I'd labeled Wedding. Financial on my phone's cloud drive, organized by vendor, because that is the kind of woman I am. "Give me an hour," she said. "You have 40 minutes," I said. "The ceremony starts at 3:30. I want to begin cancellations before the vows." There was a pause. "Peggy," Diane said, and her voice had a careful note in it. "Are you sure about this? Once we start—" "I'm sure," I said. "I'm very sure." I hung up and began going through the folder. Each contract, each receipt, each wire confirmation. The paper trail of a year's worth of love that had apparently been one-sided. The amounts felt different now. Not generous. Confiscated. While I waited for Diane's callback, I did one more thing. I called Thomas. He answered immediately because Thomas always answers immediately when I call, which is something I had apparently taken for granted. "Mom? What's wrong?" "I'm in the parking lot at the vineyard," I said. "Your sister just told me I'm not welcome at her wedding." The silence on his end lasted exactly 4 seconds. "Tell me everything," he said. So I did. And while I talked, the sun moved in the sky over Napa Valley, and somewhere beyond the oak trees, guests were settling into white chairs, and a wedding was about to begin. Without me, for now. Diane called back in 38 minutes. She had reviewed 4 of the 7 contracts. "The catering balance is your cleanest shot," she said. "They haven't begun service yet. Setup was scheduled for 2 o'clock, but the contract specifies service commencement as the point at which the balance becomes non-refundable. I'd argue setup alone doesn't constitute commencement. That's $26,000. What else? The photography studio. The $10,000 balance isn't due until image delivery, so that's simply a matter of notifying them you're withdrawing from the contract. They keep the deposit. You owe nothing further. The lighting company, similar structure, balance on completion. That's another $9,500 you don't have to pay. The band? 50% paid, 50% on performance. Same logic, don't pay the balance. That's $7,000. We went through the rest. When she finished, the recoverable or preventable amount was $187,000. The venue deposit was gone. I had accepted that. Several smaller vendors had been paid in full, but nearly 60% of what I'd spent could still be addressed. Send the cancellation notices, I said. All of them, simultaneously. Peggy, you understand that this stops the wedding in practical terms. The band won't play. The caterers will. I understand what it does, I said. Send them. I need you to confirm that in writing. Email me from your registered address right now, so we have a timestamp. I typed the email in 60 seconds and sent it. The timestamp read 3:04 p.m. The ceremony was scheduled to begin in 26 minutes. I should tell you what happened next in that parking lot, because I want you to understand that I was not enjoying any of this. I sat with my phone in my lap, and I felt the weight of what I was doing. A wedding was a day that only happens once. I knew that. I had had my own 40 years ago, in a small church in Ohio, with carnations and a cake that leaned slightly to the left, and it had been the most important day of my life. I was not canceling my daughter's wedding because I wanted revenge. I was canceling it because I had been given a very clear message about my value to the people involved, and I had decided, calmly, legally, completely, to respond in the only language they had demonstrated they understood. Money. At 3:12 p.m., my phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. This is Derek. I don't know what you think you're doing, but you need to stop. Now. I stared at that message for a long moment. How did Derek know? Diane had sent the cancellation notices to the vendors only. No one at the vineyard should have told him yet. The notices would have gone to business emails, not to a groom standing at an altar. Unless someone was watching. Unless someone had anticipated this. I forwarded the text to Diane with a single note. Save this. Then I drove home. Thomas arrived at my house in Pasadena 40 minutes later. He's 38, quieter than Claire, an engineer who thinks in systems and speaks in precise sentences. He stood in my kitchen doorway and looked at me the way he had looked at me when Harold died. That expression men get when they're frightened, but trying to behave like they aren't. Are you all right? He said. I'm functional, I said. Sit down. I need to show you something. Over the next hour, at my kitchen table, I laid out everything I had collected over the past several months. Because here is what I have not yet told you. I had not been entirely unprepared for this. The Sunday calls that had shortened. I had started keeping notes. Brief entries in a journal I kept in my nightstand, dates and details. Called Sunday. 9 minutes. She mentioned the florist 3 times, asked nothing about my week. Small things? The kind of evidence that seems paranoid when you're collecting it and obvious in retrospect. But there was something else. 3 months ago, I had hired a bookkeeper named Carl to reconcile my personal accounts. Purely routine, I do it every year. Carl was thorough, and in being thorough, he had found something. One of the wire transfers I'd made, the $78,000 venue payment, had been processed through an account I didn't immediately recognize. I had, at Claire's request, transferred that money not to the venue directly, but to an account she described as a wedding escrow that she and Derek managed for convenience. The account was legitimate. The venue had confirmed the payment. But Carl had noted that the account had a second authorized signatory, Vivian Holt. I had filed that fact away, I had not been sure what to do with it. Now I was sure. Derek texted me at 3:12, I told Thomas, and slid my phone across the table. The cancellation notices went out at 3:07. He knew in 5 minutes. That means someone at one of those vendor companies contacted him directly, or someone was monitoring for exactly this kind of action. Thomas read the text. His jaw tightened. "Mom," he said slowly, "the venue account. You said Vivienne was a signatory." "Yes." "Has any of that $78,000 been moved?" I looked at him. Then I called Carl. Carl called back in 20 minutes. The venue had confirmed the full payment was held correctly, but he had found something else while he was looking. A secondary transaction, 3 weeks after my original transfer, in which $4,500 had been moved from the escrow account to a personal account registered to Vivienne Holt, described in the memo line as administrative fee. An administrative fee? For a wedding escrow account that I had never agreed to. Thomas was quiet for a long moment after I told him. "That's theft," he said. "That," I said, "is evidence." By Sunday morning, the world had caught up with Saturday. I had slept, not well, but enough, in my own bed in Pasadena, with the windows open and the ceiling fan turning slowly, and the particular silence of a house that has held grief and come through it. I have lived alone since Harold died. I have learned that solitude and loneliness are not the same thing, that the first is a condition and the second is a choice. That night, for the first time in months, the house felt like mine again. Diane called at 8. The catering company confirmed they halted service at approximately 3:45 when they received the notice, she said. The band is cooperating. The lighting crew left before setup was completed. The photography studio acknowledged the cancellation. The venue situation is more complex. I'm drafting a demand letter citing the unauthorized escrow transaction as grounds for partial recovery. It won't be quick, but it's a legitimate argument. The $4,500 transfer to Vivienne? I've referred that to a colleague who handles civil fraud. Depending on how cooperative the bank is, we may be able to file within the week. I thanked her and went to make coffee. Thomas called at 9. "Claire has been calling me since last night," he said. I haven't answered. "You don't have to protect me from whatever she's saying," I told him. "I'm not protecting you," he said. "I'm just not answering." At 11, my phone began in earnest. First was a call from a number I didn't recognize that turned out to be Derek, calling from a different phone. Apparently, he had anticipated I might block the first one. I let it go to voicemail. The message was 40 seconds of controlled anger dressed as concern. "Peggy, this is Derek. I think there's been a serious misunderstanding, and I'd like to speak with you directly. What happened yesterday was..." I deleted it without finishing. Then came Claire. She called 4 times in 20 minutes. On the 5th call, I answered. "Mom." Her voice was raw, which meant she'd been crying or wanted me to think she had. "Do you have any idea what you did yesterday? Do you have any idea how—" "Claire," I said calmly, "I'm going to stop you there. I have nothing to say to you right now that would be productive for either of us. If you'd like to have a real conversation, I am available, but not today. You ruined my wedding. You uninvited me from my own wedding," I said. "The one I paid for. It was my wedding." "Which I paid for," I said again, the same tone, the same pace. $312,000. Silence. "When you're ready to have an honest conversation," I said, "you know where I live." And I ended the call. That was when Vivienne arrived. I heard the car in my driveway before I heard the doorbell. A large SUV, the particular crunch of tires on my pebbled path. I looked through the front window and saw Vivienne Holt getting out of a silver Range Rover, followed by Derek, followed by a man in a dark jacket who I would later learn was a lawyer. I opened the door before they could ring the bell. "Vivienne," I said pleasantly. "Derek, I see you've brought help." The lawyer, he introduced himself as Paul Shearing, family law and civil litigation, began to speak first in the measured tone of a man who considers himself the most reasonable person in any room. The substance of his message was this: what I had done constituted intentional interference with a contractual event, potentially actionable as tortious interference. The emotional distress caused to the wedding party could be the basis of a civil claim, and he strongly advised me to cease all legal actions and return, or guarantee the return, of the wedding funds to allow the couple to rebook at a later date. I let him finish. Then I said, "Are you aware that your client's mother transferred $4,500 from a wedding escrow account she had no legitimate claim to?" The silence was immediate and complete. Vivienne's expression did not change. She was too practiced for that. But something behind her eyes shifted. A tiny recalibration. Derek looked at her sideways. Paul Shearing looked at his shoes for half a second, which told me everything. He knew, or he suspected. Either way, he had not been prepared for me to say it out loud on a Sunday morning in my doorway. "I think," I said, "that if Mr. Shearing files anything on your behalf, my attorney will file a response that includes the bank records from that escrow account. I look forward to discovery." They left. Not quickly, not with dignity entirely intact, but they left. Derek's hand on Vivienne's arm as they walked back to the car, heads close together. The quiet, urgent conversation of people rethinking their position. I closed my door and stood in my hallway for a moment. My heart was beating harder than I would have liked. That was all right. Hearts are allowed to beat hard when you have just faced 3 people down on your own front porch. I called Thomas and told him what had happened. "Mom," he said, with something that was almost but not quite a laugh, "you just told a lawyer to bring it." "I told a lawyer the truth," I said. "That's not the same thing." That week, I gave myself 3 days of deliberate quiet. I walked in the rose garden behind my house. I called my old friend Rosemary in Portland and talked for 2 hours about nothing related to weddings. I ate good food and read 3 chapters a night of a novel I'd been putting off for a year. I was not hiding. I was storing energy, the way you do before a long, necessary effort. The call came on a Wednesday. I was in my kitchen, making tea, when my phone showed Claire's name. I considered letting it ring, then picked up, not from weakness, but from strategy. Know your opponent. Never stop listening. "Mom," Claire said, and her voice was different this time, softer, almost tentative. "Derek and I have been talking. We both think we got off on the wrong foot with everything, and we'd really love to start over. The 3 of us, the 4 of us with Vivienne, we'd love to take you to dinner." I poured my tea. "That's kind of you," I said, in the neutral tone I'd learned from years of negotiations with vendors who thought charm was a form of currency. "We were thinking somewhere nice, wherever you'd like." "Mom, we're family. Whatever happened at the wedding, it was a terrible miscommunication. Everyone was stressed." "Claire," I said, "was I or was I not told to leave my daughter's wedding?" A pause. It was, yes, but there were reasons, and I think if we sat down. "Were those reasons connected to your mother-in-law having access to the escrow account through which my money moved?" The pause this time was longer. "I don't know what you're talking about," Claire said carefully. She did. I could hear it in the specific quality of that carefulness. The same voice she'd used at 16 when she knew exactly what she'd done, but was testing whether I could prove it. "I'm not going to dinner," I said pleasantly, "but thank you." "Mom?" "Goodbye, Claire." I stood at my kitchen window and watched a hummingbird visit the feeder I'd hung for Harold 12 years ago and continued to fill out of habit and affection. The bird hovered, drank, departed, clean and purposeful. That was what I wanted to be. Clean and purposeful. The dinner invitation was bait. I understood the shape of it. A reconciliation meal at which I would be made to feel guilty, isolated, perhaps confused about my own memories of what had happened, and would ultimately be maneuvered toward withdrawing the legal actions and restoring the financial situation to one favorable to them. It was the oldest script in the family conflict playbook. It required the target to be hungry for peace and afraid of permanence. I was neither, but I was also not invulnerable. That week had shown me where the soft places were. The moments of silence in my house in the evenings, the hours after 10 when Harold's absence was most specific and most loud. I am honest about this. 64 years old, alone, in legal conflict with my own daughter. I was not a woman without fear. I was simply a woman who had decided not to be ruled by it. So I did what I have always done when I need to not disappear into myself. I reached outward. I called Rosemary again, and this time told her everything. Rosemary is 71 and has survived a divorce, a bankruptcy, and a son's estrangement. And she has the calm of someone who has stood on the far side of several catastrophes. "Peggy," she said, when I'd finished, "do you know what I think?" "Tell me." "I think you already know exactly what to do. I think you've known since you were sitting in that parking lot. I think you're calling me because you want someone to tell you you're not wrong." I laughed, which surprised me. "Am I?" "You are not wrong," she said firmly. "You are being managed by people who assumed you would behave like a prop. You are currently behaving like a person. I fully support this." She also gave me a practical suggestion. A therapist she trusted. A woman named Dr. Elena Vasquez, who worked with families navigating legal conflicts. "Not because you're falling apart," Rosemary said, "but because having a professional in your corner who understands both the emotional and legal landscape is just smart." I made the appointment. Dr. Vasquez and I met for the first time that Thursday in her office in Santa Monica, which had large windows and a particular quality of late afternoon light that made everything feel slightly more manageable. She was in her 50s, warm but precise, and she said something in that first session that stayed with me. "The question," she said, "isn't whether your daughter loves you. The question is whether the people around her have created conditions in which that love can reach you." I thought about that for a long time afterward. I also, that week, reached out to two other people. One was my college friend Judith, who had been through her own version of financial exploitation by an in-law. She had useful, specific perspective. The other was an acquaintance from my business network, a woman named Sandra Park, who ran a nonprofit supporting seniors in financial abuse situations. I hadn't thought of my situation in those terms. Sandra quietly suggested I might consider it. "Not all financial abuse looks like someone stealing from an elderly widow," she said. "Some of it looks like a daughter forwarding invoices." I went home that night and sat with that sentence for a very long time. They came to the house on a Saturday. I had not invited them. I had not expected them, though perhaps I should have. The dinner invitation had been refused, which in the logic of people like Derek and Vivian simply meant the next move was required. A week had passed since the wedding. The legal wheels were turning. Diane had filed the initial demand letter to the venue regarding the escrow irregularity. Paul Shearing had gone quiet, which meant he was either consulting or regrouping. I was in the garden when I heard the gate. Claire came through first, in a sundress, carrying a canvas bag that I recognized. I'd given it to her 2 Christmases ago. A small, calculated detail. Arrive carrying the mother's gift. Behind her came Derek, then Vivienne. Then, to my surprise, a young woman I didn't recognize who hung back near the gate with the quiet posture of someone who had been brought as a witness or an audience. "Mom," Claire said, and her voice had a practiced warmth that I recognized from business meetings. The warmth of a person who has rehearsed sincerity. "I hope it's okay that we came. We really needed to see you." I set down my gardening gloves. "Come inside," I said, because I was not going to have this conversation in my garden where the neighbors could hear, and because a kitchen table gives everyone a defined position. We sat. I offered water. Only Claire accepted. Vivienne spoke first, which was not an accident. She had the composed, measured delivery of a woman accustomed to controlling rooms. She was 67, impeccably dressed even for a Saturday visit to a garden, and she projected the particular authority of someone who had never in her life been told she was wrong without consequence. "Peggy," she said, "I want to say something directly. I know there's been some confusion around the escrow account. A wire was processed incorrectly. My own administrative assistant made an error, and it was always our intention to correct it. I'm sorry it became a source of tension." An administrative assistant. The account she personally held signatory rights to. The $4,500 moved to her personal account, described as a fee. An error. "That's interesting," I said. "I'll share that explanation with my attorney." Vivienne smiled. It did not reach her eyes. "I was hoping we could resolve this within the family. These legal processes, they're damaging for everyone. They take time. They cost money. And frankly, Peggy, at our age..." She paused, and something in the pause was intentional. "These kinds of prolonged conflicts can be very stressful at our age." She had chosen those 3 words deliberately. She was telling me something, that I was old, that I was alone, that conflict would cost me more than it would cost them. She was also, subtly, suggesting that I was not entirely stable, that a woman of a certain age who canceled her daughter's wedding and filed legal actions might be seen as erratic, might be seen as someone whose judgment was compromised. I felt a cold thread of fear move through me, and then, behind the fear, something harder. "Derek," I said, turning to him directly, "did you know that $4,500 was moved from the escrow account?" Derek looked at Vivienne for a fraction of a second. Too short for him to catch. Not too short for me. "I had nothing to do with the account management," he said. "That's not what I asked." He met my eyes. "No," he said. He was lying. I couldn't prove it in that moment, but I knew it the way you know certain things after 64 years of watching people. The answer was too fast, too clean. "Mom?" Claire said, leaning forward, her voice urgent and slightly trembling, in a way that I recognized as genuine. She was not entirely performing. She was also frightened, which meant she was caught between things I couldn't fully see. "Please, we can fix this. The wedding can be rescheduled. Derek and we can have a real conversation about everything. But we need you to stop the legal process. It's making everything worse." "What would fixing it look like?" I asked. "You withdraw the legal actions," Vivienne said before Claire could answer. "We resolve the escrow question privately. The wedding is rescheduled, this time with your involvement. We move forward." With your involvement. As if my being at my own daughter's wedding were a concession. "And the $4,500? I asked. "Will be returned to you," Vivienne said smoothly. "In exchange for signing a release of all further claims?" The silence that followed was 1 second too long. There it was. They wanted me to take $4,500 and sign away the right to pursue anything further. They wanted me to resolve privately what should be resolved legally. They wanted me to disappear back into the role of the generous grandmother who wrote checks and asked nothing. And in exchange, they were offering me a seat at a rescheduled wedding and the return of a fraction of what had already been taken. I stood up. "I appreciate you coming," I said. "I'll have my attorney respond." Derek's politeness evaporated first. "Peggy, you're being unreasonable. You're going to destroy your relationship with your daughter over—" "You destroyed that relationship," I said very quietly, "on a Saturday afternoon in June, in a vineyard I paid for, when you let my daughter tell me to leave." "You don't know what you're talking about," Vivienne said. And there it was. The mask, as I'd been told it would come. Not violent, not loud, but absolute. The expression of someone who has never been effectively refused. "I know exactly what I'm talking about," I said. "Please leave my house." They left. This time not in the measured, strategic retreat of the Sunday porch visit. This time in the quiet, tight fury of people who had played their best card and been declined. I stood in my kitchen after the door closed and felt my hands shaking. Just slightly. Just enough to know the fear was real and not nothing. But it was the kind of fear that doesn't slow you down. It was the kind that reminds you of what is at stake. I stood there and let it move through me, and then I picked up the phone and called Diane. "They came in person," I said. "They asked me to sign a release." "Tell me everything," Diane said. I did. The deposition was scheduled for a Tuesday morning in late July. It had taken 5 weeks to get there. 5 weeks of document requests, bank subpoenas, and the slow, methodical work of Diane's civil litigation colleague, a man named Robert Chu, who spoke in understatements but moved with precision. The fraud claim regarding the $4,500 transfer had expanded in scope as the bank records came in. What had appeared to be a single unauthorized transaction had turned out to have a more complex architecture. The escrow account Claire had asked me to wire the venue payment to had been opened specifically for the wedding. That was true. What was also true was that Vivienne Holt had been added as a co-signatory not for convenience, but at the explicit written request of Derek Holt, a request documented in the account opening paperwork. Furthermore, in the 3-month period between my transfer and the wedding, 2 additional transactions had moved money out of the escrow account. The $4,500 to Vivienne's personal account, and a second transaction of $11,200 to an LLC registered in Nevada under a name that required 2 more weeks of research to trace back to Derek. $15,700 taken from my money, used before the wedding had even occurred. The venue had been paid correctly. The full $78,000 had reached them. But the money had flowed through an account that had been treated by Derek and Vivienne as a resource they could dip into along the way. I want to be precise about what this was and was not. The venue was paid. The wedding would have happened as planned, and I would presumably never have known about the diversions. This was not a scheme to steal the entire sum. It was something more practiced and more contemptible. It was the assumption that a little could be taken, quietly, because I was the kind of woman who would not look closely enough or would not know what to do if she did. That assumption was the most expensive mistake they had made. The deposition took place in Robert Chu's conference room, a clean, spare room on the 12th floor of a building in downtown Los Angeles. Vivienne arrived with Paul Shearing. Derek arrived separately, which I noted with interest. Separate counsel. The first sign of alignment beginning to fracture. Claire was not there. I had been informed she had submitted a written statement instead. I thought about that on the drive downtown. Claire, absent from the room where the consequences of her choices were being examined. Whether that was strategy or shame or something I didn't yet have a name for, I could not say. Robert Chu began with Vivian. She was composed. She had been prepared. Her account of the escrow arrangement was fluent. A matter of convenience, a standard practice for managing wedding finances. The $4,500 a reimbursement for time spent coordinating vendors. A legitimate administrative service for which she had neglected, she acknowledged, to produce a formal invoice. A correctable oversight. Robert let her finish, then set 3 documents on the table. The first was the account opening paperwork showing Derek's written request to add Vivian as co-signatory. The second was an email exchange between Derek and Vivian, recovered from the account documentation, in which he had written, "Take the fee now, before the final vendor invoice is clear, less visible that way." The third was the corporate filing for the Nevada LLC, showing Derek as sole director. Vivienne looked at the documents. For the first time in all the weeks I had been dealing with these people, she had nothing ready. "Mrs. Holt," Robert said, "would you characterize the phrase less visible that way as consistent with a standard administrative arrangement?" Paul Shearing put his hand on Vivian's arm. "My client needs a moment to—" "I understand the document," Vivienne said, overriding her own attorney, which was the first thing she had done that was unplanned. Her voice was still controlled, but underneath it was something I had not heard from her before. The specific brittleness of a person whose story has just been made insufficient. Derek's deposition was worse. He had maintained, throughout the preceding weeks, the position that he knew nothing of the account transactions, that the escrow had been managed entirely by his mother, that he had been focused on the wedding, that he was as surprised as anyone by the findings. Robert had let him maintain that position. Now he set the email exchange on the table. Derek looked at it. Then he looked at Paul Shearing. "I'd like to take a break," he said. "Of course," Robert said. "We'll reconvene in 15 minutes. I was sitting across the conference table, and I watched Derek Holt stand up, and I saw, very clearly in that moment, the structure of what had been built and what was now collapsing. He had thought of me as a resource. His mother had thought of me as a resource. They had looked at a generous woman who loved her daughter and seen not a person, but a mechanism, a reliable source of funds with insufficient oversight. They had planned around that assessment with confidence and, I think, with genuine surprise that it had proved wrong. In the break, I went to the window and looked out at Los Angeles and thought about Harold and about Claire and about the hummingbird at the feeder and about the fact that I had spent a year's worth of love in $312,000 and received, as its return, a parking lot and an instruction to leave. Then I thought about what came next. When we reconvened, Derek's attorney made a statement. Derek would be amending his previous account. He and his attorney needed additional time to review the documents. This was legal language for, "The story is changing." Vivienne said nothing more that session. She sat with a stillness that was no longer composed. It was frozen. I sat quietly through all of it. I did not perform satisfaction. I did not look at them with triumph. I looked at the table and at Robert's documents, and at the evidence arranged with such care on that clean surface, and I felt something I had not felt in 2 months. Certain, not angry, not sad, not vindicated in the small, hot way that revenge operates. Certain, the way you feel when a calculation you've trusted finally balances. Robert walked me to the elevator afterward. "I want to be honest with you about timing," he said, "but I think you should know. Based on today, their legal position is considerably weaker than it was this morning." "Thank you, Robert," I said. "Don't thank me yet." "I'm not thanking you for winning," I said. "I'm thanking you for taking me seriously." He looked at me for a moment. "That," he said, should never have required thanks. The settlement offer came 8 days after the deposition. Paul Shearing sent it to Diane, who called me on a Thursday afternoon with the careful, neutral tone she used when results were better than expected. The offer was the full $15,700 in recovered funds, plus legal fees, plus a formal acknowledgement of the unauthorized transactions, plus, and this was the part I had not expected, a written statement from Derek and Vivienne accepting responsibility, which Paul Shearing had almost certainly advised them to include as a condition of the agreement not proceeding to a public civil filing. They did not want this in court. In court, the email, less visible that way, would become a public record. In court, Derek's amended account would be examined against his original sworn statements. In court, the Nevada LLC would be traced and explained. Paul Shearing was a competent attorney, and a competent attorney had looked at the full scope of what Robert Chu had assembled and concluded that his client's best outcome was to pay, acknowledge, and disappear. "There's a non-disclosure clause they've proposed," Diane said. "Decline it," I said. A pause. "Peggy, a non-disclosure would limit your ability to speak about—" "I know what it would do," I said. "Decline it. They want silence because silence protects them. I'm not interested in protecting them." Diane declined it. They accepted without the NDA. The signed settlement arrived the following Monday. I sat at my kitchen table and read every page of it. It was 12 pages. On the final page, above Derek's signature and Vivienne's signature, was the acknowledgement paragraph, the statement that the transactions had been unauthorized, that the funds had been improperly diverted, that Margaret Ellen Caldwell had been damaged by these actions and was entitled to the recovery. My name in a legal document, written correctly. I put the papers down and made a pot of coffee and sat in my kitchen for a while. The venue dispute was resolved separately 2 weeks later. Diane's argument about the escrow irregularity as grounds for partial contract review had enough merit that the venue agreed to release $31,000 of the deposit, not the full amount, but nearly half. They were not villains in this story. They had been paid correctly and had provided their space in good faith. The partial return was a courtesy extended in recognition of the unusual circumstances. Total recovery. The $15,700 settlement, plus the $31,000 venue partial return, plus the $52,500 in services that had been canceled before completion. Combined with the photography, band, and lighting balances, I had simply declined to pay $147,200 returned or protected from a total outlay of $312,000. Not everything, but nearly half. And more importantly, the acknowledgement, the document, the signatures. I had received the concession I had not sought but had needed, proof that I had not been wrong about what I'd seen. The divorce proceedings began 6 weeks later. Derek filed, I learned this through Thomas, who had maintained careful peripheral awareness of the situation, citing irreconcilable differences. The Nevada LLC became a point of contention in the asset division. Whatever Claire had known or not known about Derek's financial arrangements, she was now living in the aftermath of them. She had retained her own attorney. I did not speak to Claire for 4 months after the wedding. That silence was not punishment. It was space. The kind of space that certain things need before they can be said honestly. When she finally called, it was on a Thursday evening in October, and her voice had a quality I recognized from when she was 7 and had broken something accidentally. Not the performance of remorse, but the real thing. "Mom," she said, "I didn't know about the money." "I believe you," I said. And I did. Not because I was naive, but because I had thought about it carefully and concluded that Claire had been manipulated by Derek and Vivienne in ways that intersected with but were not entirely the same as what they had done to me. "I knew you weren't invited," she said. "That was my choice. A terrible choice. I let Derek and his mother convince me that." She stopped. "It doesn't matter what I was convinced of. I did it." "Yes," I said, "you did. I'm sorry, Mom. We talked for 2 hours. I did not forgive her completely in that conversation." Complete forgiveness is not a single moment. It's a long project. But we began. That was enough for October. Thomas came for Thanksgiving. I cooked. The house was warm and the table was full, and I thought about Harold the way I always do at that table, gratefully, mostly, and thought about the year that had passed with something that was neither triumph nor grief, but something steadier than both. Justice, maybe. The particular satisfaction of having been tested and having met the test honestly. By the following spring, my life had changed in ways I was not sorry about. I returned to work. Not out of necessity, but because the legal process had reminded me I was still sharp. I became a consultant for a catering industry association, advising on contracts and vendor relationships. Hard-won knowledge, put to use. I also joined the advisory board of Sandra Parks' nonprofit supporting seniors in financial abuse situations. Their work was practical and real, educating families, providing free consultations to people who didn't know they had options. I had options because I had resources. Most people don't. Rosemary came to visit in April. We planted tomatoes and argued about basil, and the whole visit was so ordinary and warm that I thought about it for weeks. The specific happiness of the uncomplicated. Claire and I rebuilt slowly, which is the only honest way. Dinner once a month. She told me she had been, in her own words, too grateful to ask questions. I didn't absolve her, but I understood her better. Thomas remained reliable as ever. Third Sunday of every month, easy conversation that required no performance from either of us. As for Derek and Vivienne, the Nevada LLC became a serious problem in the divorce proceedings. 2 of Derek's real estate clients did not renew. A third cited concerns about due diligence. Vivienne sold the Range Rover. I felt no satisfaction in their suffering, only in the operation of consequence. I had simply declined to erase the record of what they had done, and that record had traveled at its own pace. That is different from revenge. That is justice at its quietest. The hummingbirds came back to the feeder in March. I stood at the window and thought about Harold and Claire and the parking lot in Napa Valley and the woman I was still becoming. 65 years old. Silver hair that looks like moonlight. A life considerably larger than the one they had tried to leave me with. My tomatoes came in beautifully that summer. So that is the story of the day I was told to leave and everything that followed. What I learned. Generosity given without discernment is not love. It is a vulnerability. Your value is not measured by how much you give, but by how you respond when that giving is taken for granted. What would you have done in that parking lot? I'd genuinely like to know. Leave your answer in the comments. And if this story stayed with you, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Thank you, truly, for listening.